Good afternoon. My name is Geisler, and today I will be presenting the research that I have been working on with Dr. Price and Dr. Shah on the regional variation in electric vehicle emissions under United States temperature conditions and the efficiency of federal electric vehicle investment. So I'll start with the part of the project that you're probably a little bit more familiar with, and that's the relevance of electric vehicles today. Electric vehicles, or EVs, are marketed as a greener alternative to gasoline-powered vehicles. The industry is growing rapidly, and with it, so is investment. And electric vehicles are targeted as a very popular source of investing for a more sustainable future, given the fact that transportation accounts for 28% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. But what makes electric vehicles different from standard gasoline-powered vehicles? Well, instead of an internal combustion engine, they have battery packs consisting of several lithium-ion batteries. And these are rechargeable, given that the emissions associated with an electric vehicle come from the charging of the batteries. And they consist of a negatively charged graphite anode, as well as a positively charged cathode, and the makeup of which distinguishes what type of lithium-ion battery it is. For the purpose of my research, we will be looking at the nickel manganese cobalt oxide, or NMC battery type. And lithium-ion batteries, because of their electrochemical properties, degrade in two ways. The first being cycling capacity loss during the electric vehicle's use, and calendar capacity loss during the EV's storage period. The rate of this capacity loss is affected by a multitude of factors, one of which is temperature. So that prompts the question, do the environmental benefits of electric vehicles exist equally across different geographies? And so let's take a look at the existing literature on this idea of electric vehicles' sustainability benefits varying geographically. There are really four main factors that have been studied which contribute to a variance in electric vehicle benefits, and that's climate, driving behavior, power grid, and charging behavior. Now let's dive into some of those specific studies. The first of which looks at the power grid component. And here, Holland and his colleagues measured the emissions associated with charging an electric vehicle in different counties in the United States, given some average driving behavior. And here, the idea is that electric vehicles require different amounts of energy and produce different amounts of emissions due to the fact that the energy used to charge the electric vehicles is coming from different electricity interconnections, such as the Western, Eastern, and Texas interconnections. And they found that comparing the emissions associated with charging these EVs to a social cost of emissions, which essentially is a dollar value associated with the harm that emissions cause to humanity. They found that comparing this financial cost of these emissions against a EV purchase subsidy indicated that a purchase subsidy would only have positive benefits in 11 states. The next study that I want to highlight looks at both the climate and the driving behavior components of EV variants across geographic locations. This paper takes a bottom-up approach on energy use, where Yang and his colleagues created a model of a lithium manganese oxide graphite battery pack and tested them under monthly hourly ambient temperature and average driving conditions for each US state. They tested the cycling capacity loss as well as the calendar capacity loss that I mentioned earlier. And their first finding is that the amount of energy and greenhouse gas emissions from driving 1 kilometer is not constant, but actually increases as the battery degrades, resulting in different emissions associated with an EV, as graphed on the right, per each state. They also found that the battery life varied significantly as well. And so, what are the takeaways from these two studies, and how does that relate to my research? Well, if you think about the first paper, it looked at that second step of comparing the actual emissions associated with EVs to the stakeholders, the investors. And the first one decided to isolate the impact of temperature. And so that led me to my research question, how does the variance in electric vehicle energy usage associated with lithium-ion battery performance under climatic conditions lead to inefficient patterns of investment under current federal EV programs? So let's start by taking a closer look at the data set. The data set for the study needs to be relevant to the stakeholders, the investors, which is why I'm collecting climate data from metropolitan statistical areas, which are the 394 geographic entities used by federal statistic centers, and therefore are where a lot of the population in the United States are concentrated. And so an EV in one of these metropolitan statistical areas is exposed to different climatic conditions. And papers such as Yang and his colleagues consider the convection component, the idea that the ambient temperature or the outside temperature can cause the battery to heat or cool outside of its optimal temperature range. But that's a battery pack level approach. the importance here is looking at it at a vehicle level approach, because not only is the battery being heated and cooled, but as is the cabin. And so because of that, there needs to be an entire EV thermal management system which deals with heating and cooling the battery, as well as maintaining a cabin temperature at a comfortable level. And so by looking at the entire vehicle level approach, you're able to consider what some studies don't, and that's the solar radiation component. This is a very relevant component, given that 75% of a car's interior temperature is contributed to solar radiation, because the heat of the sun not only contributes to the air that you feel outside, but also directly causes heat transfer into the cabin and into the battery. And so this can be measured by the global horizontal irradiance, or GHI, where irradiance is synonymous for solar flux. And so this data has been collected from the NREL National Solar Radiation Database alongside with hourly temperature, as showed on the graph on the left. And so the issue with solar flux data, and why a lot of other papers might overlook this or simplify it, is that it's very noisy data. As you can see on the graph on the left, the spikes are the maximum solar fluxes that are reached throughout each day. And then as you can see, not only is there a rise and a drop in the solar flux in the day, but over the course of the year, there's also a trend in the maximum solar flux for each day as well. And so being able to capture this in discrete simulations, which I'll get into next, can be very difficult and lead to thousands of simulations. And so our solution for our model is taking the average temperature and the average solar flux for each month, given a drive time and given a location, such that these discrete simulations can be performed for the overall simulation at the end. So what exactly does that mean? Well, given all this data, we determine the power demand by the battery and how it degrades using two different simulations by Gamma Technologies. And the first is their EV thermal management model as a part of their GT Suite software. This allows us to simulate a specific drive in which we fix the temperature and the solar flux and some drive cycle, and we're actually able to output a power demand on the battery given a specific drive. And so all of these discrete drives and the power demand for each drive are then inputted into the second simulation, and that is the real-world aging model. Here, the input power request is put into the driver's schedule, their weekly schedule, whether that be a normal week or a vacation week. And from that, the auto-lithium battery model is what we're going to be using to be able to look at how that battery degrades under those hourly temperature data that I mentioned earlier. And so from this, we're able to not only get the capacity degradation, but also the battery life of the battery when we're looking at long-term implications. And so the future objectives for my research would be to measure those tailpipe emissions. I will run the real-world aging model and be able to determine what the battery life is, as well as the energy consumption over the course of the battery's life, and then essentially convert this into emissions using some US average metric for the emissions associated with a unit of electricity. And then second will be that life cycle analysis. So looking at not only the emissions associated with driving the electric vehicle, but also producing the electric vehicle. Each time an EV would have to be replaced over a given time frame due to that degradation issue. And then lastly, compare these financial metrics against current EV investment to determine exactly how efficient EV investment is now and craft an argument for the heterogeneity of federal EV investment. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to any questions.
So you mentioned the difference between Alaska, there's like 13 years of battery life, and Florida around 5 years. And so my mind kind of went, well, that's because of the temperature. But I was wondering, do you have any data there about the miles driven? Because I can imagine in a small town in Alaska, I'm not driving my car as much. Mm-hmm. If I live in Miami, I'm probably driving with a lot of traffic. So it may not be the temperature, but maybe it could be. Do you have data on like how many hours the batteries were used before they were kind of out of commission?
Yes. While I don't have the data on the specific number of hours that the vehicles were used in each state, we do know that the calendar capacity loss ends up having a larger effect on the actual battery degradation, because if you think about it, you might be taking 2 to 3 drives per day, but the majority of the time your vehicle is sitting in the garage. So the temperature effects on the battery pack are actually due to majority due to the calendar capacity loss component. And so while the cycling capacity loss was pretty equal across the states, we saw that majority of that discrepancy in the battery lifespan was due to the calendar capacity loss. And because the paper by Yang and his colleagues only looked at a battery pack model, they didn't necessarily consider the power demand of the electric vehicle, but instead looked at how temperature specifically caused it to degrade. And so since we know that batteries tend to degrade a little bit more under the hotter temperatures, that's why we saw a shorter lifespan for Florida as opposed to somewhere like Alaska.
So you mentioned using monthly average temperatures for one of the simulations, but using hourly temperature for another simulation. Do you think you could explain that further?
For sure. So the ideal situation was to use hourly temperature for everything so that we had the most discrete data and the most accurate representation of how that battery is going to be degrading in real life. However, the challenge came with having two separate simulations that weren't integrated. The output of the thermal management model was put then into the real world aging. And so to think about it, if you think about when you drive, your time of day as well as your day of the year are going to affect what that drive is going to look like. Essentially, every drive is unique. And so to have to run the EV thermal management system model for each drive would be thousands of simulations. And so by creating sort of an average of what an 8 a.m. commute would look like in the month of January, for February, and so on, we're able to perform less simulations that we would have to then input into the real world aging model.
I was wondering, what were the reasons behind choosing this specific lithium-ion battery chemistry for your project? And how would different battery chemistries influence the results of your research?
Like I mentioned earlier, the NMC is the most popular used battery in the United States. Another battery type that we were considering was LFP, but why we ended up choosing NMC is we want to look at the status quo as it relates to federal EV investment. And so because our sample size is looking at the United States, it was important to consider what that looks like right now, as opposed to maybe what it will look like in 10 or so years as LFP batteries become more popular. Regarding their differences in terms of their performance, although NMC is more expensive, it does perform better at those lower temperatures. And so for the simulation, we're able to model the best case scenario when it comes to climate resistance by using the most climate resistance option on the market and determine that even under those best case scenarios as it is in the status quo, there is still discrepancy in the EV performance as a result of temperature differences.